Hi, we're here with Dr. Lyons, and she's going to tell us what she does.
Hi, my name is Kelly Lyons, and I am a professor in biology, and I've been at Trinity University for about 21 years now. And I originally started in the humanities. I was interested in international relations and then became a scientist after that. And I trained at UC Davis, and at that school, it's a terrific ag school. And there were many, many, many great ecologists there and great plant biologists. And so I trained as a botanist, and I became a specialist in grasses over time, just because they are so much the foundational part of grasslands. And later, I'm of course very interested in forbs and other grass, things that are non-grasses that exist in prairie ecosystems. But grasses tended to take my attention away because those are the primary things that seem to be the drivers of grasslands, and that's why they're called grasslands. And so I have studied over time how diversity influences how ecosystems function. I have also looked at how invasive species affect how those ecosystems function. And a lot of that brings me to study soils and nutrient cycling and those kinds of things. I focus less on species interactions above plants, but I am also very interested in the upper food web, portions of the food web that utilize grasslands. I am broadly trained as a botanist in other ecosystems, but primarily my work is now in these grassland ecosystems, mostly in Texas, but I've also worked in Mexico and other places. Yeah.
So, what can you tell us about sustainability and advocacy for native plants and specifically native grasses in Texas and more specifically on the Trinity campus?
Well, it's interesting because when I first got to Texas, I assumed that people knew a lot about grasslands because it's such a rangeland focused culture. And what you learn over time is that people say, if I'm a rancher, then I actually grow grasses, not necessarily cattle. They focus on the grasslands first. But what you realize is that the dynamics of grasslands are really subtle. They're subtle plants, and people who know their grasses really know their grasses tend to. And I sort of operate somewhere in the middle where I really am trying to reach out to people and talk to them about their grasslands without getting too technical. But I have written articles, like, for example, for the Rivard Report or the San Antonio Report, and you can look those up, that I thought were pretty accessible, but in the end, it's actually a really tough field to convey to the public. So one of the things that's happened in California over time that's a really good lesson for all of us is that those grasslands there were primarily perennial grasslands, and then they were transitioned when the Spaniards came into annual grasslands. And that makes a big difference for carbon sequestration and overall health of the ecosystem. And what's happening in Texas is that we transitioned from perennial grasslands to other kinds of perennial grasses that are invasive, and now we're introducing those Mediterranean annual grasses to the system, and we're transitioning to an annual grassland. I can talk to ranchers all the time that are really good at their business, and then when I talk about these kinds of things, they seem pretty fundamental, but they're also hard to grasp. It's hard to know which grasses you have and what's happening to your ecosystem. And so I'm finding that I've just got to learn to break it down more. And so part of that advocacy question for me is learning to communicate better about a system that seems simple, it's just a grass, and is actually quite complicated.
So, what are some specific species native to Texas that sort of have been pushed out or replaced by invasives and annuals?
So the primary invasion process was that our perennial grasses were displaced by other perennial grasses, mostly from Eurasia. Although as you go south from here, you get into buffalo grass, which is from South Africa or Africa. Southern parts of Africa, and then there's also other grasses like guinea grass that are moving into San Antonio. Those two grasses are typically found only in South Texas, and they've been moving this way. We see them now all over the San Antonio River, and I find them sometimes even in Austin. The other grasses that moved in that displaced our perennial grasses are Clayburgh bluestem and KR bluestem, and those actually we refer to them as Old World bluestems. There's also in that mix Angleton and Australia bluestem, and those have transitioned our grasslands into less diverse perennial grasslands that are also not very good forage, which has been problematic. And I'm really glad to get away from studying buffalo grass because it is good forage, even though it's invasive. Ranchers kind of like it, but these other grasses, at least they're invasive, they're homogenizing, and ranchers typically don't like them. So that's easier for me to message and get funding for that. And so that's been the big transition. And so your question was about which natives have been pushed out, right? And the primary natives that we focus on are the ones that have typically been considered good forage, and the reason that they disappeared along with the invasion is that they're really yummy, and so cattle like to eat them. And we call them ice cream plants or decreasers. And so cattle get in there and they eat the yummy stuff and they leave the yucky stuff, and those are increasing over time. So the grazing dynamic combined with some of the fire dynamics have really changed the way our grasslands look. And some of the really specific beautiful grasses that we've lost are yellow Indian grass, big bluestem, little bluestem, side oats grama. A lot of the windmill grasses have declined. We have a lot more Texas wintergrass and purple threon, which are nice natives, but they're not as palatable to cattle, and so ranchers don't like them as much, but they're really good grasses. They're very reparative. And so once you get the grasses back in, you can start to think about the forbs and all the other diversity that you might like to have there, but the grasses are really the primary thing that we've lost.
So what kind of grasses does Trinity use in our lawns?
Well, in the lawns, we're primarily using St. Augustine. There is some use of zoysia, I know, in some places on campus. And then, of course, Bermuda grass comes in, it's very opportunistic. What's great about Bermuda grass is it's not going to go away anytime soon, and you can drive on it, you can do, parties on it, and usually it's fine. But I know that they're having a big battle right now with the soccer fields, and I think it's great because, the Premier League only uses grass, the real grass. But in the United States, we've been transitioning to plastic grass, which I think is a shame because most people who watch soccer really just want to watch people play on grass, real grass. And we have a coach here who's from England who's very insistent that we keep it grass, which I love. I think that's great, and I hope we do. It's better for your body, too, overall. We're finding it's really much better for your body. So those are the kinds of grasses we have on campus. We're hiring somebody right now who's going to be, there's a person in charge of landscaping, and they're going to be second in charge, the assistant director of landscaping, and they are very knowledgeable about the developed grasses that you were talking about. What was the one you mentioned? Habiturf.
Yeah.
Habiturf, and then also just using buffalo grass, which is a really cool low growing grass that's native. But those go dormant, and so a lot of people don't like them. But what I'm recommending that we do, and other people are thinking about this too, is putting up signage that says, we're sleeping. Plants are supposed to go dormant in bad times of year. And we can irrigate a lot because we're using the recycled water from the city. So if you see any of those purple irrigation lines on campus, that's the recycled water. And that's water that we paid $1 million to have those lines put in, and I think over time it's probably saved us a ton of money because we can use that recycled water from the city. And so people will complain about the campus being green, but you can sit kind of pretty calmly about that because we're doing it in a pretty sustainable way. And then if we introduce some native grasses that are much less low water use, then we can be in a really good place to use that water elsewhere and start to zone better on the campus, right? And say, okay, these grasses over here are going to be the native grasses that don't need that much water, and then we're going to save that water for areas that we're going to make like maybe little rain gardens that need a lot more water, and even getting into aquatics or something along those lines. But if we can transition the entire campus to things that are much more sustainable and much lower water use, much more climate tolerant and climate ready, right, for what's going to come in the future, we're going to be it's going to be a prettier campus, but we're also going to be in a space where we can make maybe more exotic gardens somewhere else and use water for those, right? And you can also put like lots of color for graduation in one spot and water that a lot, and then keep the rest of the natives, that are less water use. There probably will be a transition at some point to Habiturf for most of the grounds, but it's going to take some cultural changes and some education so people understand what's happening. My hope is that the campus looks more like South Texas, right, where you guys come to college, right? And my son's going to Lewis and Clark, and that's like a whole different look. You go there and it looks like Portland. Why can't students come to Texas and it look like Texas? I think we should have more agaves, more what the native habitat looks like, and that's why you're here, right?
So what are some of the benefits of implementing native grasses, not just for landscape purposes, but for ecological purposes? How does this benefit our local wildlife?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it creates a baseline for other plants to be planted in it, right? If you want to build a prairie, the baseline really is grasses. And so you can build these native grasses that are, again, low water use, and we'll build, they actually carve out a little space in between where forbs can get established, so wildflowers. And then native grasses themselves are actually larval resources for a lot of butterflies. And so that's one good thing. It also provides ground nesting habitat for ground nesting birds. It can also provide resources for making nests, right? So all that stuff. And then insects, as you increase grasslands and grassland diversity, you get just more insects in general, grasshoppers and all those kinds of things that birds eat, right? So you're making food for all the higher food web levels when you build a native prairie. And they are among the most diverse habitats in all of the temperate world. And so if you build a diverse baseline, a net primary productivity baseline, then you're going to build higher productivity at the higher food web levels, and then also generally means higher diversity.
So what are some of the challenges of planting and taking care of native grasses? In what ways are they different from our current lawn system? And in what ways, are they easier to take care of?
Yeah. Well, part of the issue is that they haven't been developed horticulturally as much as like St. Augustine. So imagine how long St. Augustine has been in the horticultural milieu. And that means it's been selected for and all this stuff to look like it does when you water it a lot, right? Or you add a lot of nitrogen to it. It's going to look like that. The native grasses have not been as well studied or as well developed, I would say, like we talk about plant material development. So unfortunately, the USDA has historically focused, the plant material centers have focused on developing these sort of non-native stuff because it actually does do better because it's introduced without its native enemies, we say, right? So native plants are going to have more natural enemies, and that could be microbial, that could be an herbivore, it could be all sorts of things. So it's just a little bit harder to establish them. They do require a little bit more
care. But now, as time has gone on and we've had more plant material development, they are just much more reliable. But what we need, as an institution, because we're a liberal arts educational institution, why can't we be doing that? Why can't we be taking chances with these grasses and using our gardens as demonstration gardens for other people? And we can be testing these varietals, like all the different varietals that are developed through plant material centers or through just the horticultural trade. We can say, we'll take them onto campus and we'll test them out for you, make sure that they will establish well. I mean, do they need more nitrogen or less nitrogen or more phosphorus, more potassium? Are there some varietals that just establish better in South Texas, or what's happening with the impending climate change issues? What happens when it freezes? And I do think that's documentation that we could be collecting, and students could be collecting that. We could build a little citizen scientists, just demonstration campus. I'd love to see Trinity getting back to being the forerunner in sustainability as we were when we received a great award from the city of San Antonio for the green roof for sustainability, and we'll get back there. COVID did not help us very much on the landscape issues. Yeah.
So, do you enjoy the green spaces on campus?
That's kind of a loaded question. So, because I walk through campus and I just think, well, I'd really like to replace that with the following. So we've made a list I worked with a student, Grace McGavern, who was my research student, to build a list of plants we'd like to see on campus and things we'd like to see replaced. And then I tried to always replace with the following to make suggestions. But just recently, there were some plants that right now, the landscape crew is really kind of in a panic because there's going to be all these parents on campus, and the trustees are coming and graduation, all that stuff. So they're under a lot of pressure. And I've noticed they've plopped in some invasive species. And so I'm going to give them a minute to, just sit with those, and then I'm going to flag them and tell them to get them out. Because, one of them, there is Pennisetum fountain grass over there that they do not want there because you need a backhoe to get it out after it gets established. You really don't want it there. So stuff like that. So my mind's always like, yes, no, good, bad. So it's calming. Or at a time like a year like this, I look around, most of the big trees you see are native, which is great. We have our woody species are in really good shape. But you look at things like this, I think this were introduced from Asia and Morasia. That's actually Houston. And so, and it's in a good place, right? It's in this little bioswale here. But that it's for some reason that hasn't been activated completely. So I'm always working in my mind like that. So this new person that we're hiring, their mind works like that too. So that'll help me calm down when I cross campus. Yeah. I should add also that we have a terrific crew in the administration that
our executive leadership team that's very aware of this, and they're going to be putting a lot more money into it going into the future. They've already allowed the landscape team to hire, I think it's 8 or 9 more team members, and they're going to be zoned in each. Hopefully we'll have like competitions in different areas of campus between them.
In the future, in an ideal world, what would you have Trinity's landscape look like?
Well, it's tricky because if you'd asked me this 20 years ago, I would have said native, and we're going to look at relictual communities in Texas to figure out what we should plant. But now we really need to be looking south, right? Because the zones are coming this way. We were in zone 7, 8, now we're like 8, 9, and 10, 20 years ago from now, we're going to be solidly in zone 9, USDA zone 9 planting zone. And so I would like for the campus to be looking forward and making predictions about what trees we might be using here that maybe are much more Mexican, and then again setting an example for the rest of the region for what to use. And now we've got, we just got the master plan done for a new arboretum here in San Antonio, which I was really involved with, and they're going to be developing their own varietals of shrubs and trees and other woody species, right? And we can collaborate with them to figure out what we ought to be growing here. I would like to see a collection. I'd also like to see us become an arboretum. My alma mater, American University, became an arboretum, and it's not that hard to do, to become a level 1 arboretum and then just move up from there. I mean, you got to tag your trees and keep track of it. But so those things, I'd like to see us climate ready. I'd like to see us thoughtful. I'd like us to be about place with a capital P, meaning like eco-regionally placed. Students come here and they feel like they're in Texas. Right? We're not trying to be Italy or anything else, or Swarthmore or whatever. We're trying to be here, and that's why students come here. It's because it's warm and it's nice and it's pretty, and we have a great campus. We have a beautiful campus. So I'd also like to see us setting those goals for everybody else.
Thank you.